The trail of blood snaked across the dusty yard to his water pump. Caleb Warwick had spent 42 years on this unforgiving Nebraska homestead, long enough to tell a coyote's blood from a man's, and this was no animal. His calloused hand tightened on the shotgun as he followed the crimson stains. Around the weathered shed, what he saw stopped him dead in his tracks. A young native warrior slumped against the rusted pump, one hand clutching a jagged wound in his abdomen, the other trembling toward the tin bucket dangling just out of reach. The man's breaths were shallow, ragged, his dark eyes sharp with pain, but alive with a wary vigilance, tracking Caleb's every step like a cornered wolf expecting a bullet. This was 1872, a time when finding a native on your land spelled one thing: danger. The kind that could leave a man gutted in his bed or his cabin reduced to ashes by dawn. Every settler within 100 miles would tell Caleb the same thing. Put a slug in the stranger's head and bury him where the prairie grass would hide the grave. Caleb raised his shotgun, finger brushing the trigger. It was the logical move, the safe move, the move his neighbors would applaud. But something in those eyes held him back. It wasn't just pain he saw, it was a bone-deep thirst. The kind Caleb had known during the brutal summer of '68, when the creek dried up, and he'd gone for days with nothing but dust in his throat. A universal need that cut through tribe, tongue, or the lines drawn by war. The warrior tried to speak, his lips cracked and bloodied, but only a hoarse rasp escaped. Water. Caleb lowered the barrel and reached for the bucket. His brother in Omaha would call him a madman, softened by years of isolation. The homesteaders down the valley would say he was begging for a raid. Maybe they were right, but as he knelt beside the stranger and tilted the bucket to his lips, watching him gulp like a man pulled from a desert grave, Caleb felt a certainty settle in his gut. He was crossing a line, one that would reshape their fates in ways he couldn't yet fathom. What he didn't know was that this wounded man wasn't just any wanderer, and the events he'd set in motion would bring more horsemen to his homestead than he'd seen in a lifetime. The warrior drank greedily, draining 3 buckets before his hands steadied enough to hold the tin himself. Caleb watched, his mind racing. In this territory, showing kindness to a native was as good as painting a target on your back. As color crept back into the man's face, Caleb's eyes caught something that chilled him to the bone. The wound wasn't from a blade or a misfired arrow, it was a bullet hole, fresh, still oozing. The skin around it scorched with powder burns. Someone had shot him at close range, and recently, which meant the shooter might still be out there, following the same blood trail that led to Caleb's doorstep, maybe riding toward his homestead right now with rifles loaded and no patience for explanations. The warrior seemed to read his fear. With effort, he lifted a trembling hand and pointed toward the horizon, then drew a finger across his throat. The message was unmistakable. Trouble was coming, and soon. Caleb's heart pounded like a war drum. Every instinct screamed to drag this stranger off his land, erase the evidence, pretend he'd never been here. But the man could barely sit upright. Moving him would likely finish him off. Leaving him here was just as bad, a beacon for whoever was hunting him. Then he heard a sound that had kept him alive through 15 years on the frontier. Hoofbeats, distant but closing fast, multiple horses, riding with purpose straight for his homestead. The warrior heard them too. His eyes widened, not with defiance, but with raw fear, and he tried to shrink against the pump, as if willing himself invisible. Fresh blood seeped through his fingers where he pressed his wound. Caleb grabbed the bucket and splashed water over the blood trail, scrubbing the dirt with his boot. But there was no time to erase it all. The riders would be here in minutes, maybe seconds. He glanced at the wounded man, the stranger who'd upended his quiet life in the span of an afternoon, whose presence could get them both killed. Yet those dark eyes held something Caleb hadn't expected: gratitude, pure and human. The kind that made you question everything you'd been taught about enemies. The hoofbeats grew louder, close enough to count 6 horses, maybe 7, moving at a gallop that promised no friendly visit. Caleb made his choice in a heartbeat, knowing it might be his last. He couldn't carry the man far, but he could hide him. The root cellar behind the shed, if they could make it. But as he reached to help the warrior up, the man grabbed his wrist with surprising strength and shook his head. Then he did something that sent a shiver through Caleb's bones. He smiled. Not a grateful smile, but a knowing one, as if he understood exactly who was cresting that hill. The riders appeared like a thunderhead breaking the horizon, 7 men on horseback, dust swirling in their wake, rifles catching the late afternoon sun. Caleb recognized the lead rider instantly, Marshal Vernon Slade, a man whose name was whispered in saloons from Lincoln to Cheyenne. Slade was a lawman who preferred lead to questions, especially when it came to native troubles. He collected bounties like trophies and called it duty, the kind who'd torch a homestead without blinking if he thought it harbored trouble. Caleb stood in front of the pump, shielding the warrior from view, trying to look like a man concerned with nothing more than a loose fence post. His mouth was dry as prairie dust. Slade reined in his horse a dozen feet away, close enough for Caleb to see the cold glint in his gray eyes. The other 6 men fanned out, hands on their holsters. This was no courtesy call. "Afternoon, Warwick," Slade said, his voice slow and deliberate, like a man who knew he held the winning hand. "We're tracking a wounded native. Blood trail leads right to your land." Caleb felt sweat prickling his brow despite the evening chill. "Haven't seen any natives, Marshal. Been fixing the north fence all day." Slade's gaze swept the homestead, missing nothing. His eyes lingered on the damp dirt near the pump, where the blood trail hadn't fully washed away. Caleb's stomach twisted. "That's so." Slade dismounted, his boots crunching the gravel. "Because that looks like blood to me. Fresh blood. Unless you've been slaughtering hogs by your drinking water, I'd say someone's been here." Behind Caleb, hidden by the pump's shadow, the warrior stayed still as stone. But Caleb could feel his tension, taut as a bowstring. One sound, one twitch, and they were both dead. Slade took a step closer, hand resting on his revolver. "You know the penalty for hiding native fugitives, don't you, Warwick? Same as treason rope around the neck till you're gone." The words landed like a noose tightening. Caleb's muscles coiled, ready to fight or bolt, knowing neither would save them. Slade was too close now. Any move would reveal the warrior, and then the shooting would start. Then the impossible happened. The warrior spoke, not in English but in his native tongue, a fluid string of words that rose like a song, clear and strong despite his pain. The sound froze Slade mid-step. The color drained from his face, and his hand fell from his revolver. His mouth worked silently before he rasped, "My God, it's you." The 6 riders dismounted in a rush, their weapons forgotten, their faces a mix of shock and something deeper fear, but not of an enemy. The fear of men who just realized they'd stepped into a trap they couldn't outrun. Slade turned to Caleb, his face pale as frost. "Do you know who you've been helping?" Caleb stared at the marshal's shaken expression, his mind reeling. In 15 years on the frontier, he'd never seen Slade flinch from outlaws, not from blizzards, not even from the Sioux raids that had razed his settlements last winter. But now Slade looked like he'd seen a specter. The warrior spoke again, this time in flawless English, his voice resonant despite his wound. "Tell him who I am, Marshal. Tell him why you rode so hard to find me." Slade swallowed hard, his voice breaking. "This is Tala, son of Chief Onawa of the Lakota. He's the one who brokered the ceasefire with Fort Benton last fall." Caleb felt the earth tilt beneath him. The ceasefire agreement that had halted for years of bloodshed between settlers and Lakota, saving countless lives on both sides, making it safe for families to homestead without fear of night raids. And he'd been giving water to the man who'd made it possible. But if Tala was a peacemaker, why was he fleeing with a bullet in his side? There was an ambush, Tala continued, his breathing labored, but his words gaining strength. For days ago, a meeting with Major Harlan about extending the ceasefire to the southern plains. But Harlan had other plans. Slade's face went from pale to ashen. "Major Harlan's dead," he said. "Shot in the back during a native attack 4 days ago. You're wanted for his murder." "Because that's what they want you to believe," Tala said, pushing himself straighter against the pump. "Harlan wasn't killed by natives. He was killed by men wearing war paint, speaking just enough Lakota to fool the witnesses. Men who knew exactly when and where we'd meet." The words hit Caleb like a sledgehammer. Someone had staged Harlan's murder to frame Tala, to shatter the ceasefire, to set the plains ablaze again. "Who?" Slade demanded, though his tone suggested he already feared the answer. Tala's eyes hardened. The same men who've been selling rifles to the rogue bands. The same men profiting from this war. The same men who sent you to hunt me down instead of the real killers. Caleb's dread deepened. He'd thought he was just aiding a wounded man. Instead, he'd stumbled into a conspiracy that could ignite the entire territory. But what chilled him most was the realization that if Tala was right, Slade hadn't come to arrest a fugitive. He'd come to silence one. The silence stretched like a fraying rope. Slade's 6 men shifted in their saddles, hands near their guns, eyes flickering between their marshal and the wounded Lakota, who'd just accused the territorial powers of treason. Caleb saw the conflict in Slade's facet duty warring with truth, orders clashing with conscience. Men like Slade didn't wrestle with morals, they buried them under gunfire. Even if you're telling the truth, Slade said, his voice low, I have my orders. You're wanted for Harlan's murder. Dead or alive. Dead's easier. Dead men can't testify, Tala replied, unflinching despite the pain etching his face. Dead men can't expose who gains from another war. One of Slade's men, a young deputy with jittery eyes, leaned forward. Marshal, if he's right about the ceasefire, quiet, Ellis, Slade snapped. But Caleb saw doubt creeping into the marshal's eyes like cracks in a frozen river. Then Tala made his move. With trembling fingers, he reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out a bloodstained paper. This is why they tried to kill me. A letter from Major Harlan, written the night before he died. Slade stared at it like it might bite. What's it say? It names the men supplying weapons to the rogue bands, Tala said. Dates, amounts, enough to hang a dozen men, including evidence that someone in the marshal's office has been taking bribes to look the other way. The words struck Slade like a blow. His face paled further, and his men exchanged uneasy glances, suddenly engrossed in their saddle horns. Caleb's pulse raced. He was watching a corrupt man realize his secrets were unraveling. You're lying, Slade said, but his voice wavered. Am I? Tala held up the letter. Harlan trusted me with this. Said it was insurance. Slade stepped forward, hand on his revolver. Give me that letter, so you can burn it? Tala shook his head. Let me live to reach the Lakota Council tomorrow, and I'll keep your name out of it. The offer hung heavy. Caleb saw Slade weighing his options, calculating survival. But what happened next caught everyone off guard. Deputy Ellis dismounted and approached the pump, hands raised. Marshal, I've been thinking. Remember that crate of rifles that vanished last spring? We were told natives stole it. I saw those same rifles a month later with traders heading south. The confession cracked the group's unity. Other deputies nodded, recalling inconsistencies. And Caleb realized Tala had done something extraordinary which at a shot. He'd turned Slade's men against him. Slade's hand tightened on his revolver, his face twisting. You're all idiots, he growled, his composure gone. You think this savage's word means anything against mine? You think anyone will believe a dead native and a pack of traitors? The deputies spread out, hands on their guns, but their faces showed doubt. Years of following orders battled the dawning truth that those orders were rotten. Tala struggled to his feet, leaning on the pump, blood staining his hand. The truth doesn't care who speaks it, Marshal. It just is. The truth, Slade spat. The truth is you killed an army officer, and I'm claiming the bounty. He drew his revolver, aiming at Tala, but before he could fire, Ellis stepped into the line of fire, his own gun raised. Stand down, Marshal. The words echoed across the homestead. Four deputies joined Ellis, their weapons trained on Slade. Only one man, a grizzled deputy named Gorman, stayed loyal to the Marshal, his face as hard as his boss's. You're making a mistake, Slade said, sweat beading on his brow. This'll cost you your badges, maybe your lives, maybe, Ellis replied. But I'm done making mistakes for you. Caleb watched, heart in his throat. 7 armed men on his land, guns drawn, each convinced they were right. This was how bloodbaths began, how good men died for bad causes. Then Tala did something unexpected. It began to sing. Not in English, but in Lakota, a deep, resonant melody that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The ancient words carried across the homestead, speaking of honor, sacrifice, and unity against betrayal. The effect was immediate. The deputies lowered their guns slightly, caught by the song's power. even if they didn't understand it. Even Slade seemed transfixed. But Caleb realized Tala wasn't just singing, it was signaling, calling to his people. A message carried on the wind to those who knew how to hear it. The song ended, and silence blanketed the homestead. But in that silence, Caleb heard something that froze his blood. Hoofbeats, distant but growing. Many hoofbeats, moving fast. Slade heard them too, his face paling. How many? Tala smiled through his pain. Enough. The hoofbeats grew louder, a rolling thunder that shook the Nebraska prairie. Caleb Warwick stood rooted beside the rusted water pump, his shotgun still in hand. As the distant sound multiplied into a force that could only mean one thing, a Lakota war party, larger than any he'd ever heard, was bearing down on his homestead. Tala, the wounded Lakota warrior slumped against the pump, had just sung a haunting melodious signal. Caleb now understood, to summon his people. Marshal Vernon Slade, his face drained of color, gripped his revolver, its barrel still trained on Caleb's chest. "You did this," Slade hissed, his voice trembling with rage and fear. "You helped him call them." "I gave a thirsty man water," Caleb replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "Same as I'd do for any soul suffering on my land." The words sounded simple, but they carried the weight of a choice that had already spiraled beyond his control. Tala's dark eyes, though clouded with pain, flickered with a quiet resolve. "Enough," he said softly, answering Slade's earlier question about the number of riders. The hoofbeats were now close enough to feel in the earth, a vibration that pulsed through Caleb's boots. Too many to count. Slade's 6 deputies, caught in a tense standoff, lowered their weapons slightly, their faces a mix of doubt and dread. Deputy Ellis, the young man who dared to challenge Slade, stood firm, his revolver still aimed at his marshal. The other 4 who joined him, deputies Carter, Hayes, Lawson, and Reed, kept their guns trained on Slade and his loyal man Gorman, a grizzled veteran whose scowl mirrored his boss's. The air crackled with the promise of violence, a single spark away from a bloodbath. Caleb's homestead, once a quiet refuge, had become a powder keg. Then they appeared. Over the horizon, like a vision from a fever dream, came the Lakota riders, 40, maybe 50 strong, moving in a disciplined formation that spoke of purpose. Their war paint gleamed in the fading sunlight, a vivid contrast to the dust swirling around their horses. But as they drew closer, Caleb noticed something that defied every tale he'd heard about native war parties. Their weapons were sheathed, their posture not one of attack but of presence. At their head rode an elderly chief, his gray hair braided with hawk feathers, his bearing regal despite his age. He sat his horse with the authority of a man who'd never bent to fear or force. Behind him rode warriors of all ages, from battle-hardened veterans to young braves, their eyes fixed on the scene at the pump. Slade's hand shook, his revolver still pointed at Caleb, but his gaze darted to the approaching riders. "This changes nothing," he growled. "I have my orders," but his voice cracked, betraying the lie. The chief dismounted with a grace that belied his years and walked toward the pump. His eyes locked on Tala. The other warriors formed a wide circle around the homestead, not advancing but making their presence undeniable. Caleb felt the weight of their scrutiny, as if the land itself were watching. Then a new voice cut through the tension. "Your orders are no longer valid." Everyone turned to Deputy Ellis, who held up a folded document, its wax seal glinting in the sun. "This came through this morning, Marshal, straight from the territorial governor. All pursuit of Tala is suspended pending investigation into Major Harlan's death." Slade's face purpled with fury. "You lying piece of check your own dispatch pouch," Ellis interrupted, his voice firm. "Unless you've been too busy chasing bounties to read your mail." The chief reached Tala, his weathered hands gently probing the wound in his son's side. Father and son embraced, a moment so raw and human that Caleb felt like an intruder. The warriors let out a collective breath, as if the sight of their leader's son alive released a shared burden. The chief spoke to Tala in rapid Lakota, his tone urgent, checking the injury with a father's care. Tala responded, mixing English with his native tongue, and Caleb caught fragment words about truth, conspiracy, and the names of the real killers. When the exchange ended, the chief turned to Slade, his eyes like polished obsidian. His English was flawless, each word precise. "Marshal Slade, my son tells me you came here to murder him." Slade's revolver wavered. "I came to arrest a fugitive from your own corruption," the chief replied. "A man whose only crime was uncovering how you and your allies profit from war between our peoples." The accusation landed like a thunderclap. Slade's last loyal deputy, Gorman, began edging his horse backward, clearly weighing his odds of escape. "You have no proof," Slade said, but his voice faltered. The chief's lips curved into a smile, not warm but certain. "We have Major Harlan's letter. We have the confessions of the real killers, who spoke before they died trying to flee our justice. And we have something else." He gestured to a warrior, who rode forward with a leather satchel. From it, he drew a stack of papers that made Slade's face go ashen. "Your correspondence with the gun runners," the chief continued. "Every payment, every shipment, every lie you told to hide your tracks. Major Harlan was more thorough than you knew." Slade's world crumbled in that moment. Caleb watched a corrupt man realize his empire of deceit was collapsing. The evidence was damning, the witnesses credible, the justice inescapable. But cornered men were unpredictable. Slade swung his revolver toward the chief, desperation overriding sense. "If I'm going down, I'm taking you with me." The move was lightning fast, but Tala was faster. Despite his wound, he threw himself between his father and the gun, a shield of flesh and will. The pistol fired, and 50 Lakota warriors reached for their weapons in unison. But the shot went wild. Caleb, a simple homesteader who'd only wanted to help a dying man, had lunged at Slade, tackling him to the ground. They hit the dirt in a tangle of limbs and dust, the revolver flying from Slade's hand. The impact stunned them both, but Caleb's resolve held firm. Deputy Ellis and his men moved quickly, securing Slade and Gorman, while the Lakota warriors slowly lowered their weapons, their eyes on their chief and his son. The dust settled, revealing a scene that would haunt Caleb for years. The chief knelt beside Tala, who'd collapsed from the effort, fresh blood seeping from his wound. The old man's face was unreadable as he studied Caleb, still sprawled in the dirt, catching his breath. Then, without warning, the chief placed both hands on Caleb's shoulders and spoke in Lakota, words heavy with ceremony. "Tala, weak but alive," translated, his voice thick. "He says you are now brother to our people, that your mercy to an enemy, your risk for truth, your courage over Firthas are the marks of a true warrior." Caleb felt a warmth spread through him, like sunlight breaking through a storm. All his life, he'd been taught natives were threats, savages, barriers to progress. But in the chief's ancient eyes, he saw only wisdom, dignity, and a respect he'd never earned from his own kind. The warriors dismounted, forming a circle round Caleb. One by one, they approached, touching his hand, not a white man's handshake, but a deeper gesture, a bond beyond race or history. When the last warrior stepped back, the chief presented Caleb with a gift that stole his breath, a war lance, its shaft smoothed by generations, adorned with all feathers and intricate beadwork. "This was my father's," the chief said, "and his father's before him. It has never been carried by one not born Lakota today." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and violet, the Lakota prepared to leave. Tala's wound had been tended by their medicine man, and though he was frail, he would survive to see the ceasefire strengthened and the true conspirators exposed. Before mounting his horse, Tala clasped Caleb's hand. "You saved more than my life today, brother. You saved the peace between our peoples." "I just gave a man water," Caleb said, almost a whisper. Tala's smile was warm. "Sometimes that's how the world changed, in bucket at a time." The Lakota rode out, their silhouettes fading into the twilight. Slade and Gorman were bound and taken by Ellis and his deputies, destined for trial in Lincoln. The papers from the satchel revealed a web of corruption and runners, territorial officials, even a senator's aide profiting from a war they'd stoked. The ceasefire was not only preserved, but expanded, bringing more tribes into the fold. Caleb Warwick, a homesteader who'd shown compassion to a stranger, became the first white man in Nebraska history to be adopted into the Lakota Nation. But the story didn't end there. 2 weeks later, as Caleb repaired a fence under a crisp autumn sky, he heard hoofbeats again. His hand went to his shotgun, but he relaxed when he saw the riders, Tala, now stronger, and a small group of Lakota warriors, their faces painted not for war, but for ceremony. They carried gifts, blankets, smoked meat, and a small pouch of beads that Tala said held the spirit of their gratitude. "We come to honor our brother," Tala said, "and to ask something of you." Caleb listened as Tala explained. The Lakota Council wanted Caleb to speak at Fort Benton, to tell the settlers and soldiers what had happened, to show that peace was possible when men chose humanity over hatred. It was a dangerous request. Many settlers would call him a traitor, a native sympathizer. His neighbors might shun him, or worse. But as he looked at Tala, at the warriors who'd called him brother, Caleb knew his answer. "I'll do it," he said. For the truth, the meeting at Fort Benton was unlike anything the territory had seen. Caleb stood before a crowd of soldiers, settlers, and Lakota leaders, his voice steady as he recounted the day Tala stumbled onto his land. He spoke of the conspiracy, the greed, the betrayal, but also of the courage it took to see an enemy as a man. The crowd was silent, then erupted in murmurs, some angry, some thoughtful. A few settlers spat and left, but others stayed, asking questions, listening. For the first time, Caleb saw cracks in the wall of distrust that had divided the plains. Tala spoke next, his wounds still bandaged but his presence commanding. He held up Harlan's letter, now copied and sent to the governor, and named the men who'd tried to destroy the peace. The evidence was undeniable, and by month's end, trials began. Slade and Gorman were convicted of treason and corruption, along with a dozen others named in the papers. The gun-running network collapsed, and the ceasefire grew into a lasting treaty, one that brought a fragile but real peace to Nebraska's plains. Caleb returned to his homestead, the war lance mounted above his hearth. He was a changed man, not just in the eyes of the Lakota, but in his own. He'd learned that the greatest battles weren't fought with bullets, but with choices to see beyond fear, to act with compassion, to stand for truth no matter the cost. His neighbors were slow to forgive, but some came around, sharing coffee and stories, asking about the lance and the day that changed everything. As winter settled over the prairie, Caleb found a letter tucked into his gatepost, written in Tala's careful hand. It was simple, just a few lines, but it brought a lump to his throat. "Brother, the plains are quiet tonight because of you. We will not forget." Caleb folded the letter and placed it beside the lance, a reminder that one act of kindness could ripple across a lifetime. But the peace was not without its shadows. Rumors swirled of men still loyal to the old ways, men who'd profited from war and resented the treaty. One night, as Caleb sat by his fire, he heard a sound outside, not hoofbeats, but footsteps, stealthy and deliberate. He grabbed his shotgun and stepped into the cold, his breath clouding in the moonlight. The yard was empty, but a single arrow lay in the dirt, its fletching painted with a symbol he didn't recognize. It was a warning, or perhaps a challenge. Caleb knew the fight for peace was never truly over. There would always be those who thrived on division, who saw enemies where brothers could stand. But as he held the arrow, he thought of Tala, of the chief, of the lance above his hearth. He'd made his choice, and he'd make it again. The plains were worth fighting for, not with guns, but with the stubborn, quiet courage of a man who'd once given water to a stranger. The arrow lay in the dirt, its fletching painted with a jagged red symbol Caleb Warwick didn't recognize. He stood in the moonlight outside his Nebraska homestead, shotgun in hand, the night air sharp against his skin. The footsteps he'd heard moments ago had vanished, leaving only silence and the faint rustle of prairie grass. It was late autumn, 1872, weeks since the Lakota had ridden away from his land, leaving him with a war lance and a new title, brother to their people. But the arrow told him what he'd suspected: the peace he'd helped forge was fragile, and some men weren't ready to let it stand. Caleb picked up the arrow, his fingers tracing the unfamiliar mark. A warning, a threat, or something worse? He didn't know, but he knew one thing: the fight for truth wasn't over. Inside, by the flicker of his oil lamp, Caleb studied the arrow beside the war lance mounted above his hearth. The lance, gifted by Chief Onawa, was a symbol of trust, its owl feathers and beadwork carrying the weight of generations. The arrow, though, was crude, its shaft rough-hewn, as if meant to be found. He thought of Tala, the wounded Lakota warrior he'd saved, and the conspiracy they'd uncover a network of gun runners and corrupt officials who'd nearly reignited war on the plains. Marshal Vernon Slade and his ally Gorman were in chains, awaiting trial. But the arrow suggested others were still out there, watching, waiting. Caleb's choice to give water to a stranger had changed the territory, but it had also made him a target. The next morning, as he repaired a gate under a gray sky, a lone rider approached. Caleb's hand went to his shotgun, but he relaxed when he recognized Deputy Ellis, the young man who'd turned against Slade. Ellis dismounted, his face grim. "Trouble's brewing, Warwick," he said, glancing at the arrow Caleb had set on the porch. "Slad's trial starts next week in Lincoln, but there's talk of men trying to silence witnesses. That arrow's a message from the Blackthorn Gangoot laws tied to the gun runners. They don't want you or Tala testifying." Caleb's stomach tightened. The Blackthorn gang was a shadow on the frontier, known for ambushes and bodies left in ravines. "What do they want?" he asked. Ellis's eyes were steady. "To keep the war going. Peace cuts their profits. They'll come for you, and they'll come for Tala before he reaches the territorial court." Caleb nodded, his mind racing. He'd thought the fight ended when the Lakota rode away, but it was only beginning. "What's the plan?" he asked. Ellis handed him a sealed letter. "Tala's at Fort Benton, under guard. He wants you there. Says your story could sway the judge, maybe the whole territory. But it's a hard ride, and the Blackthorns are watching the trails." Caleb opened the letter. Tala's handwriting was neat, urgent. "Brother, the truth needs your voice. Come to Fort Benton. We'll face this together." The words stirred something in Caleb, a mix of fear and resolve. He'd never seen himself as a hero, just a homesteader who'd done what was right. But the arrow, the letter, and Ellis's warning made it clear. Doing right came with a cost. "I'll go," he said. Ellis clapped his shoulder. "I'll ride with you. We leave at dawn." The journey to Fort Benton was a grueling 3-day ride across windswept plains and rocky draws. Caleb and Ellis traveled light, their horses pushing through frost-crusted mornings and long, starlit nights. They spoke little, but Caleb sensed the deputy's unease. Ellis had risked everything to defy Slade, and now he was betting his life on a homesteader and a Lakota peacemaker. On the second night, as they camped in a shallow gulch, Caleb asked, "Why'd you do it, Ellis?" "Stand against your own marshal." The deputy stared into the fire. "My pa was killed in a Sioux raid when I was a boy. Grew up hating natives. But when Tala spoke, I saw a man, not an enemy. Made me question everything Slade taught me. If I'd shot him, I'd have been no better than the men we're fighting." Caleb nodded, understanding more than he could say. He'd grown up on stories of native savagery. Yet Tala's gratitude and the chief's honor had shattered those tales. The world wasn't as simple as he'd been told, and that truth was worth defending. But as they broke camp at dawn, a glint on the horizon caught Caleb's iron light on metal. Maybe a rifle scope. "We're being followed," he whispered. Ellis cursed, scanning the ridge. "Blackthorns. They'll wait for nightfall. We need to move." The day's ride was tense, every shadow a potential ambush. By dusk, they reached a narrow pass, the only route to Fort Benton. Ellis reined in his horse, his face pale. "This is where they'll hit us. Too tight for a clean escape." Caleb gripped his shotgun, his heart pounding. "Then we make a stand." Ellis shook his head. "No, we ride hard and pray." But before they could spur their horses, a low whistle echoed through the pass, a signal. Shadows moved on the cliffs above, and 6 men emerged, rifles glinting. The Blackthorn gang. Their leader, a weary man with a scar across his cheek, stepped forward. "Warwick, Ellis," he drawled. "You're carrying a story that don't need tellin'. Hand over the letter and walk away." Caleb's hand tightened on his shotgun. "Ain't got no letter worth your kind." The leader smirked. "Then we'll take it off your corpse." The gang raised their rifles. But before a shot could ring out, a new sound froze them. Hoof beats, dozens of them, thundering from the far end of the pass. From the dusk came a sight that stole Caleb's breath. Tala, riding at the head of 20 Lakota warriors, their horses moving like a single creature. Tala's wound was bandaged, but his posture was strong, his eyes fierce. The Blackthorns hesitated, their confidence cracking. Tala raised a hand, and the warriors stopped, forming a line that blocked the pass. "You hunt my brother," Tala said, his voice carrying like a storm. "You hunt the truth. Lay down your weapons, or you won't leave this pass." The gang's leader laughed, but it was forced. "You think your savages scare us?" Tala's gaze didn't waver. "I think you're outnumbered, and you know it." Caleb saw the calculation in the leader's eye, 6 against 20, with no cover in the open pass. The Blackthorns lowered their rifles, one by one, and Ellis moved quickly to bind their hands. Tala dismounted and clasped Caleb's arm. "You came," he said, a smile breaking through his pain. "Knew you would." The Blackthorns were handed over to Fort Benton's garrison, their confessions adding weight to the evidence against Slad's network. At the fort, Caleb found a bustling hub of soldiers, settlers, and Lakota delegates, all gathered for the trial that would shape the territory's future. Tala led Caleb to a meeting with the territorial judge, a stern man named Hargrove, who listened as Caleb recounted the day Tala stumbled onto his land. Hargrove's questions were sharp, probing Caleb's motives. But when Tala presented Major Harlan's letter and the Blackthorn papers, the judge's expression softened. "You've risked much, Mr. Warwick," he said. "The territory owes you a debt." The trial was a spectacle, drawing crowds from across Nebraska. Slade and Gorman sat in chains, their faces hollow as witnesses testified Dallas Tala. Even a Blackthorn turncoat who named names to save his skin. Caleb took the stand, his voice steady as he described the blood trail, the standoff, and the moment he chose mercy over fear. The courtroom was silent, save for the scratch of reporters' pens. When Tala spoke, holding up Harlan's letter, he named the conspirators, a territorial clerk, a trading post owner, and a captain in the Army's supply chain, all linked to the gun runners. The evidence was overwhelming, and by the trial's end, Slade and his allies were convicted of treason, corruption, and conspiracy to incite war. The judge's gavel fell like a thunderclap, and the crowd erupted, some in cheers, others in angry murmurs. But the trial's true impact came after. Tala and Chief Onawa met with settlers and soldiers, sharing plans for a broader treaty that would protect both Lakota lands and homesteads. Caleb was asked to speak, his words simple but powerful. "I ain't no hero. I just saw a man who needed water and gave it to him. If we all did that, saw people, not enemy smabe, we have less blood on the plains." The words struck a chord. Some settlers walked away, muttering about betrayal, but others stayed, talking with Lakota leaders, asking questions. For the first time, Caleb saw a glimmer of understanding, a chance for something better. Back at his homestead, Caleb resumed his quiet life, but he was no longer just a homesteader. The war lance above his hearth drew visitor settlers curious about the man who'd stood with the Lakota braves bringing gifts of respect. One evening, Tala arrived, his wound healed, his presence lighter than Caleb had ever seen. "The trees signed," Tala said, handing Caleb a beaded medallion. "This is for you, brother. The plains are at peace because of what you started." Caleb took the medallion, his throat tight. "All I did was give you water." Tala laughed. "And that's everything." Years passed, and the peace held, though not without struggle. The Blackthorn gang's remnants faded, their power broken by the trials. Caleb's neighbors, once wary, began to see him as a bridge between worlds. He never sought fame, but his story spread, carried by newspapers and campfire tales. The arrow he'd found that night became a relic, a reminder that peace was hard-won. He kept it beside the lance, a testament to the choices that defined him. One spring, as Caleb sat on his porch watching the prairie bloom, a young Lakota rider brought a message from Tala, now a council leader. It was a single line: "The water you gave still flows." Caleb smiled, knowing the truth. One act of compassion had rippled across the plains, changing not just his life but the lives of countless others. He'd faced violence, injustice, and fear, and he'd chosen humanity. That, he realized, was the real victory. The Nebraska plains grew quieter, the scars of war fading under new seasons. Caleb Warwick, the homesteader who'd once been alone, was now part of something larger, a family bound not by blood but by courage and trust. And though he never called himself a hero, those who knew his story did. Because in a world of hatred and division, he'd shown that a single act of kindness could light a path to peace. What did you think of Caleb's journey? The story of a simple homesteader who changed a territory raises big questions about violence and injustice in our lives. Should Caleb have risked everything for a stranger? Was the peace worth the cost? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us where you stand on these issues and what you believe drives conflict today. Your voice matters, and we'd love to hear it.